Hi everyone, it's Dr. Horowitz here to introduce you to our next module, which happens to be about that very tricky issue of how do you share what we might call negative or bad news with your colleagues or employees if you are in fact an administrator in an organization. Now, most of us, hopefully all of us, would rather not receive bad news if given the choice, and probably most of us would probably not like to have to give it. It's just one of those areas of life we would hope to avoid. But of course, in the world of organizations and work and supervision, that is not an option. Doing nothing about a problem, if you will, or an observation that an employee perhaps might be engaging in a practice or behavior that's just unacceptable. Now, traditionally, what typically might have happened was when a supervisor became aware of an employee acting in violation, say, of a policy, the administrator would call that employee in, sometimes read them the riot act, as they say, if they weren't very nice, or even nicely, they would simply cite the policy and the description of the behavior, and then the consequences as if there was a kind of punishment connected and that the person themselves had done something wrong rather than the behavior. Well, it took me a long time and a lot of experiences, one of which I'm going to go back in time and share with you, to realize that there were other ways to approach this whole issue of how do you deal with an employee or even a colleague who's engaging in a behavior that's not acceptable, either to you personally or to the organization itself. And it doesn't have anything to do with criticizing someone for not following the rules. But I like to use terms like interfering with someone's ability to fully contribute to the purpose of the organization. Something along those lines, or something that's interfering with that person's impact on other people as a result of their behavior. Any one of which keeps the organization from fulfilling its purposes. So let me take you back quite a few years ago, more than I care to remember. But this whole approach that I've developed and will share with you shortly really comes out of an experience I had when I was an assistant principal in a Chicago inner city school. And times probably haven't changed that much, that the job of the assistant principal for the most part was, yes, discipline. And we had a discipline code, and I was the guy who teachers sent the bad kids down, and I was the guy who took out the discipline code and had to suspend children when it was serious enough. I was the guy who had to call the parent, and the parent, of course, would come in and very often become defensive, either defend her child or criticize me, or want to point out other kids who were doing this kind of behavior and more, and why was I picking on her kid? So you've all associated with this at one point or another. And because I represented the authorities, we were the school, if I had made a decision that the child needed to be suspended, that's what happened. So you might say, well, you know, that was part of the job and maybe I was fair. And I think at that time my perspective was, yes, we had rules. They were there for a reason. We need to keep order. My job was to enforce that. Well, that went okay for a little bit until maybe a couple of years into that, when I would go home every evening and complain to my wife that yes, I may have won the battle, but I'm losing this war because I'm exhausted. Why was I so exhausted? It's not easy to have to listen to a barrage of criticism coming from parents, if you will, guardians of these students, the students themselves, who saw me as the bad guy. And I just sort of one day had an epiphany and said, there has to be a better way. And I thought about it. And some of this was based on my own survival in that sense. And I said, well, how can I maybe communicate with the parent a little bit differently so they're not so antagonistic, and so maybe they actually do something with their children, and the children themselves end up not being on a revolving door coming in and out of my office, which is what tends to be the case. You see the same children over and over. Because after all those years, one conclusion I came to was that that sort of approach with kids doesn't lead to better behavior. It just leads to repetitive behavior. So I was always dealing with the same pool of kids and never really getting any progress out of any one of them. So there had to be a better way, and there was. And I started examining what exactly I was doing and what was the purpose of all of this suspension and communication and fault finding. And then I realized the real purpose should have been to work with kids who were having difficulties, although they were not appropriate behaviors and they were disruptive, but how to get them back on track so that they themselves could take part in the reason they went to school, to learn. And that sort of set something off in me, because it also translated to the kind of language and the demeanor that I began to use with these parents who were called upon and had heard this over and over ever since their child went to school. And so I began to talk in that language. Now, this is an important point I want to make, and that was, this was never about excusing inappropriate behavior. That was not negotiable. If a student was misbehaving and there were consequences for that, up to and including suspension from school, then that's what was going to happen each and every time. But we're not talking about how the practicality of removing a child may be necessary. We're talking about maintaining positive relationships, both with the student and especially the parent. Because ultimately those relationships are what is going to and will help in searching for solutions if they are to be found. And very quickly I found it just wasn't that difficult to change some of the language and demeanor. Very often educators in particular use a form of, well, we call it educationese. In other areas they call it legalese. But it's language sometimes designed and certainly interpreted by parents to feel a kind of superiority, to have it appear as if you're the know-it-all and you have all the answers. So I quickly changed that whole vocabulary, and I started substituting words that didn't sound so emotionally charged. So I eventually discovered that, you can talk about suspension as a necessary consequence of misbehavior without ever using the word. And very quickly I began to use phrases like, well, therefore it may be necessary for your child to remain at home in order to have a bit of a time out, reflect on behavior, so that when he or she returned, she could get right back on track. And always emphasizing that it wasn't the issue that was the crime of the century. I mean, after all, by definition, can only be one crime of the century. And chances are throwing paper, getting out of your seat, even being disrespectful probably doesn't qualify as the crime of the century. Well, lo and behold, I started to notice visibly a change in the parent demeanor as the focus went from punishing a kid for misbehaving to identifying behaviors that were interfering with that child's ability to learn. And I began to explain to parents that the reason this is so important, we're having this communication, is if your son is misbehaving or behaving inappropriately while the teacher is teaching two-digit multiplication, he or she is not going to be able to move on to the next grade, where it will become even more necessary to have had that pre-learning. So this became really about helping your child in a very realistic, rational way. And once parents felt that I was not out to indict their child, and certainly not the parent, because I'll tell you another thing that I think I learned about the psychology of parents who have children who may be difficult to deal with. They see themselves as much on trial, if you will, as the child. So that when you call a parent and have a meeting about a child's misbehavior, psychologically, I believe the parent themselves feel that they are the ones who have misbehaved. And therefore, what that does is it invites defensiveness. And defensiveness is a key obstacle to effective sharing of information so that you are in partnership with a parent. And boy, I've got to tell you, if ever there was a thing called magic, it changed my entire take and career on how to work with children and parents and communities in terms of communication and working toward a common goal. So without giving all of the story away, I just wanted that background to prepare you for the actual steps that I ended up creating, if you will, on how to move through this process and how to change your demeanor and change your vocabulary and learn something that took me forever to learn called active listening, which is an art and a science we'll get to in subsequent modules. So without further time, I will invite you to view a PowerPoint presentation where I'll take you through these 5 essential steps of how to communicate bad news to a receiver. Thank you, and see you online.